We know what Trump's economic program is going to be. He was upfront about it, but you have to have a certain amount of economic history to kind of understand what he's talking about and also understand the people driving it, the leaders, Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro. So Lighthizer was the person who single-handedly saved the U.S. auto industry in the early 80s by slapping high tariffs on Japanese cars. And what he said to the Japanese 40 plus years ago, he said, you can sell cars to Americans, but you have to build them here. You have to put your factories, and they did. Those factories in Tennessee and Alabama and, different places around the South. Most so-called Japanese cars today are made in the United States. He's going to do the same thing now to the Chinese. He's going to save the U.S. auto industry and high-paying U.S. auto worker jobs by slapping huge tariffs on Chinese cars. Now, that's definitely coming. There's the USMCA. It's not the Village People song, but it's the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. That's the successor to NAFTA. And it does allow cars to come in from Mexico to the United States duty-free. So what the Chinese did as a workaround, because they're putting high tariffs on Chinese cars, the Chinese bought Mexican plants and they put their own Chinese-owned plants in Mexico so they could take advantage of the duty-free status. Trump's like, no way. We're going to throw tariffs on this. If we have to do a creative interpretation of the treaty or get a protocol or just say it doesn't apply, whatever it takes, they're going to slap tariffs on Mexican cars that are from Chinese-owned factories. Trump is reviving what's called the American system. And this was created in 1790 by Alexander Hamilton. It was supported by George Washington, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, Dwight Eisenhower. The American system had 4 pillars. Basically, it said high tariffs. The second pillar of the American system is a strong military, but a military that defends U.S. interests, not a military that runs around the world, invading countries, doing regime change, endless wars. Forget that. That's not part of the plan. But to have a strong military and a stronger Navy that can defend U.S. interests along the lines we're talking about. So think of it as not so much a sword as a shield. Sword occasionally if needed for U.S. interests, but really to protect the United States. So you have a tariff wall, you have a military wall. Third pillar, infrastructure investment, but smart infrastructure investment. Not all government spending is bad. A lot of government spending is bad. It's completely wasteful. It runs up the debt. Green New Scam. These windmills are falling apart. They're not efficient. The amount of energy it takes to build one of these windmills is more than they produce. You're killing the whales. So there are all kinds of problems with the Green New Scam. But you go back to how did the American system work in the early 19th century? It was canals, roads. Later in the 19th century, it was railroads, telegraph lines. 21st century, what would it be? Well, it would be, telecommunications, cell phone towers, 5G, 6G, supercomputers, artificial intelligence, which is, the subject of my book. So yeah, the infrastructure targets change. Maybe we need some more roads and bridges, by the way, but it's all productive. It's money well spent. It's money that pays back the economy many times over. The fourth pillar is a central bank, but it's not the Fed, a central bank with very limited powers. We had a central bank from 1792 to 1812. It was called the First Bank of the United States. And it was very helpful, but had very limited powers. It could basically lend money on good collateral to provide liquidity. That's all it did. They didn't target interest rates. They didn't target unemployment. There was no Humphrey-Hawkins Act. They weren't micromanaging the economy. They weren't pretending to do more than they can actually do. All the problems with the Federal Reserve today, which is just one failure after another, none of that was part of the picture. It was simply a source of liquidity, potentially a lender of last resort, and to help with government finance. So that's the American system. And it prevailed until 1962, and then it was the Trade Act of 1962, and then that's when the globalists took over. Globalism really was a hot topic beginning in the 1990s, but politically it really started to emerge in the early 1960s. And this was, the Austrian economists, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, others, American equivalents, etc. And what was their platform? Open borders, no tariffs, and so-called free trade, which is never free because there are all kinds of subsidies, and then open capital accounts. So they wanted money, labor, and capital and goods to be able to go all over the world, duty-free, tariff-free, open borders, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't care if you were communist, socialist, fascist, or democratic. They just wanted this nirvana of perfect price discovery where money and people could go everywhere they wanted. I've had this conversation with others and people go, well, Jim, isn't that going to be really tough on India or isn't that really going to be tough on China? I'm like, so what? That's their problem. Let the Chinese come up with some smart policies. Let the Indians come up with some smart policies, and they can. Why is it the duty of the United States to help all these foreign populations at the expense of Americans? Now, if you can help in a humanitarian sense, that's a good thing, but don't make their economic growth come at the expense of Americans. The real wages wages have stagnated for 40 years. And again, this is part of why Trump won. So it's the American system. It's been around since 1790. It works extremely well. People forget that from 1836 to 1913, the United States didn't have a central bank. It was one of the greatest periods of prosperity, invention, the telephone, the telegraph, internal combustion engine, automobile, assembly line, the harvester, indoor plumbing, movies, the electricity, electrification, etc. One of the greatest periods of prosperity in the history of the world. We had no central bank. So you don't actually need one. They have a couple of useful roles, but they're very limited. But getting back to that, trimming the Fed sails, putting up tariffs, which are not inflationary. They actually, when you have higher real wages, people can spend, productivity goes up. That's deflationary. So the egghead economists have it all wrong. Navarro and Lighthizer have it right. Trump gets it, and that's what they're going to do. So that makes it easier to make a forecast because we know what the plan is. If you talk to the economists, the Krugmans of the world, they say inflation's coming down. And it is coming down. It was 9.1% in June 2023. It's about 2.4% today. It's moving towards the Fed's goal. Inflation's coming down, but we still have inflation. Prices are still going up. They may not be going up as fast, but they're still going up. But here's the point. For Americans, so okay, inflation went from 9 to 2. Let's just say inflation was 0. It's not, but let's just say inflation was 0. Americans would still be angry because their idea is, why can't we get back to $2 butter? In other words, if it's $7 of butter and it's not going to $7.50, okay, it's at 7. But Americans think it should go back to 2. It wasn't that long ago, and that's the point. Gasoline goes from $4 a gallon to $3.75 a gallon. But Americans remember when it was $2.50. Oh, I remember when it was 19 cents, but that's another story. But yeah, Americans' idea of getting inflation under control is, give me back the prices I had like 2 years ago, not 20 years ago. And of course, that would be deflationary. That's a whole other subject. But that's how Americans think about it. Even if inflation's 0, you're still stuck at that higher level and you're angry about it because it wasn't that long ago when it was half or maybe 1/3. And that's the kind of thing. Don't listen to the PhD economists, maybe consult them on the side, but listen to the American people and you'll be in much better shape. So they were out of touch. They got the inflation issue wrong. They got the border issue wrong. Transgender sports, you want to be a transgender adult, do your thing, but don't put men in the boxing ring with women. They got that wrong, etc. So again, to my point, the messaging was not the problem. It was the message. It's fair to say, but timing matters. And here's what I mean by that. So I talked about the American system. I don't have to guess if it works. I just have to look at 250 years of history. It works. And you can go to British economic history if you want to. So it works. It's going to produce very good results for America. But I would suggest to viewers that they kind of use 2 time frames. One is 2 to 4 years forward. The other one is 6 to 9 months. 2 to 4 years is going to be great. But everything we talked about, the high tariffs, the bilateral trade treaties, infrastructure investment, all those things, they're going to take a couple of years. They're going to start on day one. When Trump finishes the inauguration on January 20th and goes to the Oval Office, he's going to have a stack of 50 executive orders on his desk, maybe 60, who knows. And they're very fancy, nice paper, and they come in these leather binders, and they got the gold seal of the President of the United States. He's just going to sit there and sign them. He's going to quit the Paris Climate Accord, put sanctions back on Iran, close the border, empower the Customs and Immigration Service, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all on day one and a lot else besides. But the programs I talked about, the economy, I hate to use a tired metaphor, but you can turn the wheel on an aircraft carrier. It keeps going straight. There's a huge lag between when you turn the wheel and when the vessel starts to turn, unless you're in a sunfish or something. But so there's a lag between turning the wheel and the vessel actually turning. The economy is like an aircraft carrier. There's a lag between your policies and the results. So 2 to 4 years, I think it's going to be great. But 6 to 9 months, we could be in a recession. There are a lot of signs of recession. They're all around. Now, here's the point. This recession will be the result of Biden-Harris policies. Too much regulation, high taxes, and a lot else. And recessions just happen. They're part of the business cycle. But if it emerges in the early part of the Trump administration, Trump's going to get the blame. He doesn't deserve the blame, but too bad. Your president, stuff happens, you get the blame. So we may see a weak economy in kind of 6 to 9 month time frame, a very strong economy in the 18 2-year to 4-year time frame. But it's going to take a while to turn that aircraft carrier. But there's an example of this, and I think a lot of viewers will remember Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was sworn in January 1981. In 81, 82, we had the worst recession since the Great Depression. Up until that time, we've had worse recessions since then, like 2008. But in 1982, that was the worst recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment was over 10%. Interest rates were on their way down, but they had been up to 20%. Economic growth crashed, etc. But from 1983 to 1986, we had 16% real growth. You don't even hear numbers like that anymore. 2%, everyone's high-fiving. Compound annual growth at in excess of 4%, 16% cumulative growth over those years between 83 and 86. So it's almost that Reagan didn't plan all this, but he kind of said, or my advice to presidents would be, recessions happen, get them over with. Like, have it at the beginning of your administration if you can, so that you finish strong and then hand off to the next candidate, or Trump can't run for re-election. But my forecast is weakness, slow growth, maybe recession, probably recession over the next 6 to 9 months. A very strong economy over the next 2 to 4 years, but we're going to have to get over that speed bump before we get to the good part. First of all, you're exactly right about the 800,000 job revision. That was a big picture, like an annual revision. They do these things. There are 800,000 jobs, a little more than that. You're exactly right. That never existed. Gone. Poof. Almost 1 million jobs. But that's in addition to the monthly revisions that have been going on for 12 months in a row. Something like 11 out of 12 months. If you know anything about statistics, I'm sure you do. If you revise downward 11 out of 12 months, that's not random. There's some systemic error in your model or in your assumptions, because if it were random, some would be up, some would be down, or you'd get them all right. So the most recent employment report came out November 1st for the month of October. 12,000 jobs were created. Expectations were 150,000 or more. It was only 12,000 jobs, which is pathetic. Number two, there were 40,000 or more government jobs, which means if you strip out government jobs from the plus 12,000, you get to negative 50,000 private sector jobs. So the private sector job creation was actually negative. A little bit of government topspin. You barely got over zero. You got to 12,000, which is nothing. And oh, by the way, if they've revised down 11 of the last 12 months, what do you think is going to happen to October? When we get to December, they're going to revise October down and make it negative. They won't care at that point because the election will be over. Again, this is dumping stuff on Trump's lap. So basically, job growth has been far weaker than has been reported all along. I won't say it's a total fraud, but it's a systemic error that they won't fix, whether it's seasonal adjustment or the birth-death cycle. What they mean is new business creation versus businesses that fail and close their doors. They don't actually know, so they make up a number. Well, if you assume more new businesses are created, you're going to assume more jobs. A lot of assumptions in these models that people aren't aware of. Anyway, so that's kind of phony. There are two employment surveys. The other one has been performing much worse. There's the employer survey and the household survey. The household survey has been much worse along the lines you're suggesting. And then on top of that, what little job creation there is, it's all going to immigrants. Not all illegal, some illegal, some not, but they're immigrants. They're not American citizens. And then real wage growth is negative. So forget these, headline, jobs created, whatever. Jobs are being destroyed. Real wages are contracting. This is a nightmare. This is part of what is going into my recession call. There are other factors. The yield curve is uninverting, going from a negative slope to a positive slope. But that means the recession is here. A year and a half ago, when the yield curve was inverted, meaning longer rates were lower than short-term rates. A 5-year note had a lower rate, lower yield to maturity than a 4-week treasury bill. Why should that be? If I'm lending to you overnight, I might want a certain interest rate, but if I'm lending to you for 5 years, I probably want a higher interest rate because I've got this credit risk, market risk, settlement risk, inflation risk, etc. That's normal upward sloping. Why would the yield curve be downward sloping? It's because the smart money knows how bad it's going to get. It's basically a forecasting tool. It says that 5% yield, that's going to look really sweet in a world of 1% yields. You're saying that inflation is coming down. Now, what's the other side of that coin? You go through 18 months and now the recession's here. What happens? The yield curve gets back to normal, but not because intermediate term rates are going up. It's because short-term rates are crashing. The 4-week bill, the 3-month bill, etc. Those rates are crashing. This shows how irrelevant the Fed is, because the Fed's not stimulating anything. They're not leading the market. They're chasing the market. Yes, the Fed's cutting rates, but the market rates are lower than the Fed target rate. In other words, the Fed's chasing the market down. Too little, too late.